Sara.
Hello, and thank you for coming this evening to discuss this really important topic. I'm super excited today to have 4 people who work in the fashion industry or around the fashion industry, and kind of a really diverse range of perspectives. So I want to start by talking a bit about why we're talking about this today. I mean, one, it's Earth Day, but also this is Fashion Revolution Week. Fashion Revolution Week is a week of events that are meant to make the industry more ethical. And this is in commemoration of the Rana Plaza disaster that killed 1,134 workers when a building collapsed and injured 2,500 others. And the thing is, that the exploitation that allowed that to happen is still rife in the industry today. And now that we're here in COVID-19 crisis, a lot of big fashion brands are pulling out their orders. They're canceling orders that are already in process. So this means that materials have been bought, or in some cases, the products have actually already been made. And when these companies don't pay for the orders, we have an unfolding humanitarian crisis. But the humanitarian crisis of COVID-19 goes much further than that. The UN has said today that we could be facing a famine of biblical proportions. 265 million people might face starvation. And that's not the only disaster we face. We're all here today as well because we are facing a climate and ecological crisis. So as the fashion industry is now on its knees with stores shut, we see that whether it's health, climate, or an economic emergency, it's the most vulnerable people that are disproportionately affected. So we know that the fashion industry, it's no secret that it's rife with overconsumption, overproduction. But there are so many livelihoods that depend on this. So what we're talking about now is, do we need a reboot of the industry, or do we need to think about transitions? So I'm now going to introduce our speakers. Well, actually, sorry, one last thing before I introduce our speakers. We are raising money today for a couple of charities in India. That these are raising money that will go to garment workers who have been laid off. So you can, if you want to give to those charities, Ajiva, I can't think how to say this name. I'm just going to spell it out. So if you go to www.aajeevika.org, you can give there, and also trade, spelled TATRAID. They are also collecting funds for garment workers. So you can go to their website at trade.org.uk/food for garment workers. And so now I'm going to introduce our speakers. Firstly, Danny Burns. So Danny is a professor at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. He's worked for 30 years in participatory processes for social change. He recently co-led Action Research Program on bonded labor in India and Nepal, which included working with spinning mill workers in Tamil Nadu. He is also the director of CLARISSA, a program designed to generate innovative, transformative change to the lives of children in the worst forms of child labor in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. And also, he has spent many years as an activist, particularly in the anti-nuclear action campaigns of the 1980s and the poll tax movement of the 1990s. Danny, is there anything else I should add? And actually, I kind of wanted you to talk just really briefly on the poll tax movement, because you know, we've got this big youth movement today that were born, I mean, Rahman, who's here today, was born in 1990, and it would be really nice to know a little bit about that.
Hi, I'm really pleased to talk to you all, to know that you're all out there. Yeah, I think the anti-poll tax movement is a really interesting one. It finished 20 years ago. Its downside was that it brought down a government and it was replaced by another government that was very similar. But its upside was that it mobilized 10 million people not to pay a tax. And if you can mobilize 10 million people in a country like ours to take non-violent direct action, then I think there's real hope for transformative change. So I guess I take those experiences into all of these other worlds around ready-made garments and leather and child labor and conflict and so on that I work in now. But I think a lot of the lessons around transformative change are very similar.
So now I'm going to move on to Faith Robinson. Faith is a consultant, researcher and producer who has worked alongside startups, individuals and brands, non-profits, and also the global fashion agenda in Denmark. And she's currently leading the editorial programming for Copenhagen Fashion Summit. So actually, Faith, I just wanted to hear in your words a little bit about Copenhagen Fashion Summit and maybe what's planned for September, because I know that you've, you know, it was meant to be about degrowth, and I think you've changed the name a little bit.
Yeah. Hi everyone. So nice to be here. We have moved the summit, so it was originally planned for May, at the end of May, and because of the crisis, we've moved it to October actually. Copenhagen Fashion Summit is the industry or the global north's leading B2B event that explores fashion and sustainability. It's an incredible gathering of different decision makers from across the fashion landscape and different stakeholders too. And we're really proud to bring everyone together every year, and we've been doing that for 10 years now. So yeah, the event will happen in October. We're obviously tracking the situation and kind of monitoring how we can produce it and to make sure these conversations happen later in the year. But yeah, Claire's going to be joining, hopefully, who's also on this panel. So that's kind of why I'm here as well.
Brilliant. Well, that leads us on to Claire. So Claire is the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and also one of the key spokespeople for Extinction Rebellion's fashion action team. And she also teaches sustainable fashion at Central St. Martin's. And Claire, you also used to have your own label. And also, I think you've been quite instrumental in the kind of art blockers, you know, that Extinction Rebellion doesn't have merchandise. I was kind of thinking maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that, how that came about.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, well, it felt to me really important that when we launched Extinction Rebellion that it wasn't going to try and save the world by selling T-shirts, right? And I was already working on a project with a friend of mine, Miles Glynn, which was a kind of, I guess it was a participatory arts project, but it was about embodying positive messages, but particularly messages of positive struggle and using the body as a space for communicating stuff. And we wanted to make it all based on kind of using used garments. A lot of the work that I've done in the past has been about upcycling and reclaim post-consumer waste and post-industrial waste textiles. So we started to gather up garments and print on them and make patches and stuff. And so the work that we were doing in that, kind of producing, I suppose, little workshops for members of the public to just come and join, kind of evolved into the art department of Extinction Rebellion, which then became like a lot of focus on screen printed patches, and then eventually onto the idea of having these wooden print blocks that you can print on the street and set up those sort of very mobile print studios that you could set up a print studio in a kind of disobedient occupied space. So for me, it was a kind of a natural evolution from a project that I had ongoing into creating the art department for XR.
Great. I'm actually wearing one of the block prints today, but you can't see it because I just see my head. And now we're going to go on to Rahemur Rahman. So Rahemur has an independent label, and your kind of design principles is to reinterpret and retell stories of South Asian identity, and particularly because you are Bangladeshi, it's about telling the stories of the craft that is there. When it's become so known worldwide for fast fashion, but there's so much more there than that. And also, importantly, you are actually raising money as well for the Hijra community. And maybe you could just say a little bit about that to start with.
So I've been working a lot with the RMG sector, and a lot of my friends who are already in Bangladesh are fundraising for the garment workers. But there was one community that a lot of people were forgetting about, which was the trans community in Bangladesh, which is the Hijra community. And they sometimes work in garment factories. They're also sex workers as well, but they're almost like a rank below garment factory workers. And it was like the unspoken community. So that's what the fundraiser is for. So if anyone wants to donate, please go to my Instagram, and all the information is there. But it is just to help them actually just pass this COVID-19 situation.
Brilliant. Okay, so I mean, that kind of leads on to what I was going to ask everyone else, actually. And it's kind of how has COVID-19 affected the businesses, organizations, and the people that you work with? And maybe we could pass on to Danny now. I mean, we have an unfolding humanitarian crisis. Like, how have things changed in your work over the last months?
Hi. I can tell you a little bit about our program. We've got a program which is focused on worst forms of child labor. It's working in Myanmar, Nepal, and Bangladesh, but the Bangladesh piece is the bit that overlaps with this because it's really focusing on leather. And there's a lot known about extremely poor conditions for child workers and workers more generally in RMG sector. But actually the leather sector is worse. And the last time I visited Dhaka slums, there's a part of the Dhaka slums where a lot of the small factory units are, or the small workshops where the gloves are cut by machines, which can take your fingers off, where the chemicals are, visible everywhere, and the small kids are. And basically you've just got hundreds of young, mostly boys, who are living in the slums, who have no money, who've got nothing to live on, and so they will go to wherever the work is. Now, if you look at the situation now, where you're looking at £2 billion worth of RMG orders collapsing, probably something equivalent in the leather industry, and a recent report which came out from BRAC, which was one of the institutes in Bangladesh, which was just really a rapid assessment of conditions in the slums right now. It showed that slum dwellers' incomes have reduced in the last, since February, have reduced by 80%. So if you think that those people were the poorest, in many cases, they were the poorest of the poor already, and now their incomes are reduced by 80%, they will be forced to take any work that's going. And in a market like this, where whatever work is going to come through, the margins are going to be right down, then it's going to be rife for opening up child labor in a much, much more extreme way. So we're expecting that a lot of the gains for the last 10 to 20 years around some of the things that we've been talking about with some companies cleaning up parts of their supply chains and so on, a lot of that might be eradicated overnight.
Gosh, because it's quite sobering to hear that. I'm just going to pass on to Faith now, actually, because maybe you can tell you're kind of working on the other side in a way. You're working with the brands, and what is the purpose of your work at the moment? What's the situation with the businesses that you're working with, the big brands?
Yeah. Well, before I start, I just need to point out that because of the corona crisis, I'm currently on temporary leave from my role at Copenhagen Fashion Summit. So during this conversation, I'm not a spokesperson for the organization, but I can talk from my own perspective. So that's what I'll go ahead and do. And I'll just give some background first. So the summit happens every year, and every year there's work around the program just as any other conference. So with the help from some really amazing experts, we started the programming for the summit for 2020, which was supposed to happen next month. We started that around the ambition to present, for one of the first times in a B2B fashion forum context, a kind of high-level discussion around the fashion industry's growth logic. Because for years that has been the elephant in the room in quite a lot of fashion and sustainability conversations, that tension, the fact that the growth of the industry is to some extent undermining the sustainability work that a community of dedicated people within fashion are working on. And there are a lot of passionate people within corporate positions that are making change. But we wanted to ask our community of decision makers if growth or success could be defined in ways other than capital gain. And in an activism community in space like this right now, that's an obvious and urgent demand. But as we can all understand, as we all know, in a business context, it's a very difficult point of view. And for a lot of corporate leaders in many different industries, it's unrealistic and kind of irrelevant question within the current way of doing business. So what's necessary is work to develop or change the business model in fashion, or the logic within the industry, towards something that is more realistic or future-proof, and to realize an industry that does deliver prosperity in a different distribution to how it does now. So that's where we started with the summit programming under the theme of redesigning growth. However, the corona crisis has delivered an industry contraction beyond anything anyone could have imagined. But this isn't the controlled or just degrowth that we were advocating for. What we're seeing is a messy response from a growth-oriented economy that has been hit by a massive shock. So to answer your question, businesses from a brand perspective, or from our side of the story, are in a shock or a crisis situation, of course. What we're seeing is that many internal teams in brands are splitting their workforce between a sort of emergency response squad that are dealing with things hour by hour as they crop up in terms of the change in their supply chain, for example, and then a separate team looking at planning ahead. So there's quite a lot of duality going on. But I guess the point of the conversation we're having now is how to work out how to rebuild from this massive contraction and to use the window of opportunity to change course. So in that respect, the objective of the summit, which will happen later in the year in October, despite changing the title of the event, which is now Redesigning Value, the mission hasn't changed. So we've moved with our community away from questioning growth and instead to questioning value. And that, at the moment, that feels more appropriate to our friends in fashion businesses. And we see it as a different way of kind of getting to the same place. So I think what this global pandemic has revealed is something that many fashion and sustainability advocates within brands and within the industry have been working to communicate already for decades, which is the hard proof now that the current business model just isn't right. So for many people, the moment that we're in right now, in the eye of this crazy COVID storm, in this kind of pause moment, it's actually the destination they've been fighting for the industry to arrive at. And that's what makes it so remarkable. So, you know, now no one can deny that things have to change, but that makes it quite scary for fashion and for all of us individually to actually start to live out our values and then examine them in order to create a roadmap for something better.
Great. I mean, Rahemur, you have an independent brand. How has this affected your work? I mean, in one way, you're more agile than a big brand, but you're also more vulnerable. So it'd be great to hear your perspective.
I guess I'm quite lucky because the brand is quite small. Anything that does affect it is actually quite a small hit, and it's something that I can handle, which makes me think about other smaller brands who are maybe a little bit bigger than mine, maybe like a medium-sized one, who will feel the impact of this and who are probably relying on a lot of the orders that are coming through, and now everything is just at a standstill. And I know there's a lot of things within the UK that are helping them, but then it makes me think about what about all the emerging designers around the world, because we're very privileged in the UK to actually have a lot of schemes by a lot of great organizations to support these young designers. But if you look around the world, there's a lot of young designers who are all coming out, who did have businesses who were just starting to come out, and then now everything is like coming to a stop. And it's them that I think about. I do count myself as someone who's quite lucky, who's actually very lucky actually to be able to still survive and actually have a living and be able to still have clients, and it's working for me at the moment. But I can't say the same for everyone else, because I know a lot of my friends who are designers, everything has actually come to a standstill. Nobody's leaving their house, there's no work to be made. All of us are just life drawing and researching and doing fun ceramic stuff. But for me, it just feels like the fashion industry in the UK has actually just come to a standstill, and everyone is just trying to overcome the corona situation. And then, which is what I'm hoping for, is that everyone will reboot and actually look at how can we transition this into a better way, so that we don't have to come back to a situation like this, where we're looking at how can we support people, where actually people should be able to support themselves through their businesses.
So Claire, I'm going to hand this to you now. How has this changed how Extinction Rebellion works? How has this changed activism? Oh, we can't hear you, Claire.
Sorry.
That's okay.
You'd think I'd spent enough time on Zoom recently to not do that, wouldn't you? How's it changed XR? Well, I mean, you know, people are trapped at home. They can't go out. They can't do their normal activities. And a lot of the work that we've built the movement on is traditional organising. It is face-to-face activity, and it is embodied activity. We're not a digital movement. We didn't just sort of spring out of a popular hashtag. We didn't, you know, grow the movement particularly digitally. We grew it with a lot of traditional methods of holding meetings and talks and getting people together. So obviously we've got digital methods with which to have our meetings and everything, but it has put quite a big pause on a lot of the main work. And I think what's interesting is if you look at the protest that happened the other day in Tel Aviv, there are people finding ways to engage in protest in certain circumstances. And I think it's going to be a very difficult challenge for Extinction Rebellion in the UK and probably everywhere else to work out what's the right time to go back out. What's the right time to go back out en masse? Then how do you do that? What does it look like? What is the messaging? People have been through an extremely sort of like traumatic event together in the face of this crisis all over the world. And I think in some ways we're seeing a lot. I don't know if you are, but like me, but I'm receiving so many think pieces, so much opinion, so many articles, and I almost can't read any of it anymore, you know, because it's just like, yeah, okay, that's what that person thinks, that's what this person thinks. And it's amazing how everybody, if you're in your digital bubble, you can like face this risk, I think, of being exposed to this endless stream of like dreamy ideas. Yeah, sure, we're at home contemplating the meaning of life. Yeah, sure, we're like, you know, fixing our clothes and like connecting with our grandma more often on the phone or whatever. Like, yeah, sure. But at the same time, like the government are about to bail out the worst industries. The government are about to do the most despicable thing with our money. The government are selling off the NHS at the same time as it's saving Boris Johnson's life, and they're pretending that they care about key workers. People are bashing pots and pans on a Thursday night saying we love the NHS, but doesn't it all just make you feel powerless, you know? And I think this is what's really, really difficult for me right now as an activist and as a member of Extinction Rebellion, is that I don't quite know how we make some of those key decisions about what's appropriate and then when to do it. But for sure, we know that like this is a moment of crisis, and that means that it's full of opportunity and it's also full of risk. So, you know, the situation that we were in previously, as Danny's explained, and Rahemur, we could just see it all get doubled down on and things get much, much worse whilst we sit sort of, we have a few weeks of our sort of at home reading thinking, oh, things could get better. There's the opportunity for it to go the other way. So it's a massive challenge for us to really, really be vigilant, I think, and really, really be ready to go out and be bold and be brave when this thing lifts, but we have no idea when that is.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something I've thought about a lot, and also there is so much content right now, and here we are producing more content, and you know, it's really been like, how can we have a discussion that actually leads to action, actually leads to us making progress? Something I've been considering a lot. So I mean, I wonder, like, if this is the new norm, we've got more crises to come. We've even potentially got societal collapse on our hands. I kind of want to bring this back to fashion. Then, you know, what is the purpose and the culture of clothing, of self-expression, and what is the purpose of the fashion industry right now? And actually, Danny, I wanted to bring this back to you because you are working with vulnerable people, and fashion in the West has become this symbol of freedom. But a lot of that freedom has come at the cost of exploitation of others. So I wanted to know, from your perspective, what do you think fashion can do that can enrich the lives of everybody?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can reflect on both the exploitation and what it can do.
Danny, can I stop you for 1 second? For Instagram, can you move your head slightly?
Yeah.
Brilliant, that's great.
Is that better?
Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah.
I could reflect a little bit on both the exploitation and, if you like, the potential. I think the potential side requires probably us to differentiate between fashion and the fashion industry. Fashion, I think, will always be an expression of you know, many things: dissent, individualism, creativity, something different to the mainstream. And I actually think that's going to be increasingly important now, because a lot of states are using coronavirus as a way of inhibiting freedoms. They're introducing legislation which could go way beyond the coronavirus, and it's quite possible that they're not going to let go of it afterwards. So I think anything that opens up those channels of creativity and expression and political dissent, whether that's through fashion or other forms of creativity, is really important. But that's not the fashion industry necessarily, that's fashion, right? The second thing is that I just don't think we can get away from the fact that, as things stand now, and maybe for a long term into the future, clothing manufacture, accessory manufacture, made from fabrics or leather or whatever, is based on exploitation. And the sort of exploitation, you know, which I've seen in the last few years, for example, with the young women cotton mill workers, spinning mill workers in Tamil Nadu. They're 16, 15, 14, 18. If they're 14, they say they're 18. If they're 18, they say they started working at 14. They're working in unbelievably hot mills. They're working 10-hour shifts, very often forced to work double shifts, 16 hours, 17 hours, maybe 2 or 3 nights in a row, and then back to 1 shift and then back to 2. They're being sexually harassed in the mills. They don't have toilet breaks. They get paid something so tiny that you couldn't contemplate living on it. If they have a health crisis, they have to borrow money, or their families have to borrow money from a moneylender, and that just creates a new spiral where new people have to be exploited in the family in the same way. And I can't put this more strongly. Of the women that I met and this research project engaged with, but we saw a pattern whereby, you know, by the time these women had got to 23, they were done. You know, they were so ill and unwell that they were not able to work anymore. And all they could do was send their daughters back into the same place to earn enough money to live on. Now, that's the sort of exploitation we're talking about. And the fashion industry is in many respects still completely reliant on all of those parts of the supply chain. And, you know, the critical thing here is that, you know, with all these corporate social responsibility policies in big companies, they tend to clean up the top layers. But as you get down into the small units that are providing, you know, the actual fabric, or cutting the gloves, or, you know, or spraying the chemicals that need to be sprayed. These are done in small, tiny family businesses. No one knows who they are. They're, except, of course, the local people who, you know, it's visible locally, but it's not visible from the corporates. So by cleaning something up at the top level, you just push it down into the hidden domains. And many people are quite happy about that. If they can't see it, then they think it doesn't exist. And I think that's the critical thing. It is based on exploitation, and that exploitation will continue to exist as long as children and their families haven't got enough money to eat, because they'll basically search out whatever work is there, and it's the only thing they can do. So you have to solve that problem, and you can't just do it within the industry, but maybe we can come back to that later.
Can I just touch on what he just said as well? So just to bring it back into the context of Bangladesh, like, this has been the worst quarter for Bangladesh, and like 264 factories have closed down. But just to really match what you said, like, the clearest example that the government really doesn't see garment factory workers as a whole community that they should be protecting is that $8 billion has been put aside by the Bangladeshi government to almost allow all of these factories, big, small, everyone, to survive this, but not so much the factory workers. It's just the business of it. And I think this is the problem. The problem isn't that they're looking at the resource, which is this massive community of people who are working in these garment factories, as valuable. What they see as valuable is actually the business itself, and that's what they're trying to protect. And if you look internationally across the world, you can see what countries actually value its workers. You'll see who's upholding what, and Bangladesh is actually just not doing it. And I think it's our responsibility across the world to kind of put that pressure on the Bangladeshi government to kind of make those changes. And I know we're all doing that work from when Rana Plaza did happen, but this is I think the domino effect of coronavirus, I think, in Bangladesh is I mean, you've just repeat what you said, it's dire.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that this leads to is to really think about what it is that these, you know, what governments need to do and what companies need to do. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about, in terms of openings that coronavirus is bringing, is that some governments, like Spain, for example, are starting to consider the possibility of a universal basic income. That's really important because it means that the actual ordinary people could survive some of these shocks instead of going to high interest money lenders or whatever it might be, which just lays more problems down the road. But, you know, in order to do that, the country's got to have a tax base. I mean, you can't provide social protection out of thin air, and it can't just be money provided by foreign governments. So that actually raises bigger questions about whether if the big industries in Bangladesh are the ready-made garment industries, are they paying their taxes? You know, let's not talk about tinkering around with this or that. Let's actually make sure they're paying their taxes. And if their taxes go to the Bangladeshi government, then maybe the Bangladeshi government can do something to support the poorest. And then the kids won't have to go into these awful work conditions. So I think we need to think a bit bigger than just what's happening in the industry. And also we need to think much more politically. It's not just about, you know, we'll improve the toilet breaks in this factory or that factory, or we won't have children, because there will always be children going into these informal, unregulated domains until we sort out their hunger or their livelihoods. And that won't happen until governments are able to actually have a proper welfare system. And that means that the fashion industry needs to contribute to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fashion industry has made some of the world's richest people on their backs. I just want to move on to faith, actually. I know we both watched this Vogue Conversations where Virgil Abloh said that fashion should serve humanity, not vanity. And I think we're all aware that, you know, the fashion industry has It's selling us things that we don't necessarily need, mostly. But if you burst the bubble, then people suffer. But I'm wondering, kind of from Faith, from your perspective, can we change to an industry that serves humanity, not vanity?
What a question. So I think that this comes back to some of the earlier points made around value. So that's where that's how I'll answer the question. So it's undeniable that this value conversation, like basically what's the point of fashion, right, is much more inclusive to, it's relevant to all parts of the industry at all across all stakeholders. And you mentioned someone like Virgil Abloh. I saw last week on his Twitter, he posted a tweet that simply was asking his community, what do you want out of a pair of sneakers? And something about the tone or the mood right now, something about that question from someone like him just made me quite speechless and shocked, because he may as well have written what is the point, and there is a point, but it's easy to identify the literal function of an object or a garment, but it's much harder to articulate the cultural or social clout associated with fashion items. And that clout, or the desire for status or self-definition, that's kind of what's made the industry what it is as we know it today, and that's what's kept these wheels going in some ways. But having said that, I mean, I'm quite keen to see data on what percentage of fashion brands are actually profitable. Does that define or validate a company's need? I'm not sure. And kind of going back to Danny's really excellent point, I wanted also to articulate the difference between like the luxury industry and the clothing industry, because they're two parts of fashion that are extremely far removed from one another in terms of desire and necessity. And it's clear that this desire is a privilege that not all cultures or communities share, directly to your point. And our culture has absolutely taken advantage of that privilege. And, most of us unknowingly, possibly until now. So we are all complicit in something. And I don't really know how to answer your question. It's so huge, but I am happy to see more people at decision maker levels in the fashion industry actually question things, because questioning the need for the fashion industry calendar that we see is a start, and I'm really happy to see that. So in an age where fashion or luxury, whatever you want to adorn yourself with, is a non-essential good, and when things like masks, are in some ways a garment, but in other ways absolutely necessary, I just think that it's a really essential conversation to be having, and that's something I want to drive. Like, how can we readdress the value of this system that we've built? And I do believe that if any industry can serve humanity better, it is fashion, because it touches so many different people and cultures, and it also literally touches all of us every day. So yeah, that's where I'm at the moment. But to Claire's point, so overwhelmed by all of the different articles and thought pieces and perspectives. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Well, thank you for tackling my big question to you. Actually, just before I pass on to Claire, I just want to say hello to those on Facebook, on Instagram and Twitter. At 9 o'clock, I'm gonna take some questions from you guys, from the audience. So please do comment in the comment bit, whichever channel you're on, and give us some questions. So Claire, I think fashion as a form of, you might not want to call it fashion, but like self-expression has been so important within Extinction Rebellion, within the activism that we do. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, on how, like, what power fashion can have.
Yeah, well, I think the original instruction that I sent out to Extinction Rebellion activists when we first launched has carried through in some ways, which was when we were going to do the Declaration of Rebellion. And I asked everybody if they thought we could just send out the request that people come wearing a suit or similar. I used to be in a group called the Space Hijackers, and we were really very well aware that when you occupy public space, if you dress in a certain way, then that completely shapes the interactions that you have with the other people, and it completely changes the way that any authority or police officer or security service or whatever, whoever's dealing with you are going to treat you very differently if you're wearing a full suit, or if everybody's wearing a stupid costume which makes you look so silly that they can't shout at you, for example, and so it's been always kind of present for me that that's important. And we also live in this kind of hyper visually literate society, right? So everybody's like used to seeing so much really, really heavily worked visual imagery, and a lot of that comes in relation to the fashion industry into the rest of advertising and stuff. So we know that we've got like an audience in this country, at least, which is kind of very, very visually very sensitive and acutely aware of what things mean when they see them. So we were really conscious that it needed to look good. And I guess something that was on our mind at the beginning was like, we don't necessarily care whether people can tell what this is about, but we do care whether they think it looks joyful, whether it looks exciting, whether it looks cool, whether it looks like something you want to be a part of, right? Because I don't want to go and hang out with the SWP with a load of their boring old placards. Do you know what I mean? Like, we needed to like break out of something, and we knew that like protest was going to be needed more than ever somehow. And it was really important to kind of, for want of a better description, make it really fucking cool. So that was really present and kind of on our minds right at the beginning. And I hope that like the way that we kicked things off helped it to have a bit of a kickstart, I think as we've moved through, it's evolved in a really interesting way. And for sure, like things that piled into the space, which we had nothing to do with from our little art team at the start, things like the Red Rebels coming, a project like that comes into the space really sort of has a big visual impact as well. And the reason why I think that's fascinating is because as a project, that's basically an A4 sheet of paper. So you can give that to someone sees a picture and they have the piece of paper, and then you say, here's how you do it. And people can set up all over the world. So you look at the global Instagram from Extinction Rebellion, just at that point when we were expanding, and I found it so fascinating that like, oh, there's red people in Turkey. Oh, there's red people in America. Oh, there's red people in Israel. Like, wow, okay, this is like, so we can see from that as well the kind of, I guess, the way that a visual meme can travel so super quick these days. And I think that also means that it speaks back to me that it is extremely important the way that people present themselves and they're perceived. And if you look back just to like the suffragettes, I mean, the branding in inverted commas was out of this world. They were masters of it. It was really well done. If you look at Martin Luther King going out and protest, they're all dressed as if they're going for church. So I guess my message has always been to people, if you really think this is the most important work that you're going to do in your entire life, then you may as well dress like it. And that really speaks to the people that look at you. And I think it's really important. So, if you know me, you'll know that I'm a very colourful person, and I quite often wear a lot of very strange clothes. And if you meet me during Rebellion, I'll usually be wearing all black and trying desperately to look extremely sensible and grown up, because I don't want to look like a stereotypical activist, which previously to XR I had a shaved head, and I was urged to grow my hair and look a bit more grown up. So I think I think it's really important, basically, because I've never had such a sensible haircut in years.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I think because I never actually introduced myself, but I'm part of the Extinction Rebellion's fashion action team, and we've kind of been doing these challenges to the fashion industry, asking them to do more for the climate and ecological crisis. And I think it's been really successful because the fashion industry has so much influence. So it's really, how can we use that influence in a better way? I mean, the other thing is, with the work with Fashion Action that I've been part of, that Claire, you've been part of as well, we have now almost run the course of a 1-year boycott of the fashion industry. So that to us meant buying no new clothing. It was a challenge to get people to see if they can, you know, go for 1 year without buying new. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy fashion. It's just about finding other ways to do it. But as we approach 1 year of this boycott, we've been, and considering the crisis we're in, we have been thinking a lot about how it can evolve, how it can do more, how we've now got this community, how can we use that community better? So maybe Rahemur, we go to you. I'm wondering, as an independent designer, kind of what you think of this idea of a boycott on new clothing. And, you know, you've been involved with making clothing in the best practice that you know. So yeah, what do you think of it? How can it evolve? How can we use this collective power that we've got?
Well, for me, I think the boycott's a good thing, because it's going to make people reevaluate, re-understand, and actually just like get their shit together about how they see clothing and fashion and what it means for people. But I think like, I think my role in all of that, I guess, is trying to basically challenge what Virgil Abloh said about fashion should serve humanity, not vanity. And I think a lot of the London designers, I don't know, maybe internationally too, we're challenging that. We're showing you that you can actually make fashion that's good for the world and actually still look fucking amazing. And I think that's the line. And I think that's what people need to start understanding, is that you don't have to buy every single day. You can buy one thing. If you can't afford, you know, like, and I think that separation between luxury fashion and high street, I think is really important, that it needs to happen, because a lot of the times we get clumped together, but the person who's buying like a £2 jacket isn't the same person who's going to buy a £5 top, and they're two very different types of customers, and they need two very different types of things. And myself as a small designer, I know I'm not sitting amongst the Zara and the H&Ms. I know I'm much more on the other end. And I think it's our responsibility to almost educate all of our people, to also, like, everyone who buys our clothing, to actually understand what clothing means. And I think the boycott does that. Is if you stop buying clothes for about a year, you actually understand how much clothes you already have, probably, first, and then actually how many of them you actually love. And then you start to actually understand, like, I mean, quite similar, quite funnily, like what Gok Wan was doing on Channel 4 many years ago, what works for your body shape. You're going to understand what clothes you like. Like, I wear a lot of pink a lot of the time, even my water bottle's pink, like, and like, I just know I'm always going to buy pink stuff. Like, Claire knows she's always going to buy colorful things. Like, you just know, and I think once you understand who you are as a consumer, then when you go out to buy fashion, you're going to make much better choices. So I'm all on board for the boycott.
Great. I mean, it's been really interesting to see that people are still buying clothing online, despite the fact that we're not actually leaving our houses. You see Boohoo, there was an article in The Guardian about how people are buying loads of boob tubes right now. And that means that people need to be in the warehouses sending off boob tubes to people. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting that, you know, I wonder if people are now really going to reassess what they need versus what they want, and why are they buying something? Surely it's got to change people's mindsets. So Danny, I mean, what can activists do right now to help the communities that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick reflection on that last point. I'm just thinking that, you know, sometimes in these situations, we all rush to the new. We all rush to what's new, what do we need to do differently? And actually, I think this is a moment where we actually need to go back. You know, we need whatever it is. We need washing machines that are repairable. We need, you know, clothes that last 20 years, not 2 years, and all of those things. And I'm quite struck by that. I do have in my cupboard an old fleece which I've literally had for 25 years, and whenever I bring it out, everyone looks at it and thinks, "Oh my God, you're not putting that on, are you?" But actually, I think that's really important, that because we are going to need, you know, everyone needs clothes. Well, maybe they don't, but let's assume for the moment that everyone needs clothes. Then there is going to have to be an industry that makes clothes. The point in terms of a sustainable industry is that it makes clothes that last for 20 or 30 years or 10 years, not one, you know, 1 year, or in some cases 1 month or one use. So I think returning to that thinking is really going to be important in this industry. What can we do? I would say, I think the most important thing, or if you like, perhaps one of the most important messages is, at least from the consumer perspective, is that you have to work with people. You know, what we know about behavior change is that people don't do things that they're told to do. And they don't just see a message and rationally look at it and say, yep, that seems right, I'm going to change my behavior. I think you really have to start to think about how you build participatory transformative processes where people are able to engage and come to those sorts of conclusions themselves. And that's very different from, you know, the industry saying it should look like this, XR saying it should look like that, you know, government saying it should look like this. I think we need a completely different way of doing things. And I think the other, you know, what goes with that also is that the change, as I said earlier, isn't going to be in just one place. You know, you have to change the whole of society to change all of this. You could actually change the whole of the fashion industry, for example, and the whole of the ready-made garment sector, and it was all beautiful and regulated and everyone's got, you know, perfect working conditions. And then you would just find that the informal, unregulated spaces opened up somewhere else. So, you know, I think you've got to address the fundamental core issues about poverty and about, you know, the fact that people can't get educations because they need to work. People can't, you know, work in nice places because the only choice they have is to work where they can just, you know, get the only work that's available. So I think, you know, just thinking about this whole thing in terms of the bigger picture, what do we need to change across the whole of society? And then how do we engage people with that? What sort of participatory processes do we need? Because it's never going to be driven by a manifesto.
You're on mute, Sarah.
God, sorry, it was going to happen at some point, wasn't it? I was wondering, Danny, if you could just say a bit more about what a participatory process is, because I think some people don't understand this.
Yeah, okay. Let me. I'll tell you a story. I mean, participatory processes can be all sorts of things, but I'll give you one example, which is that, and it goes back to the spinning mill workers, and they're all living in multiple villages in Tamil Nadu, and they're working in, you know, a whole variety of different spinning mills. And what we did was we supported them to set up what we called action research groups. So the first thing we did is that we worked with a group of them to collect stories, just literally their life stories. So in many ways, your starting point is just tell me about your life. So they told someone like them, a peer or a grassroots community worker, their story, and that was written down. And it was all of those stories were gathered together into a collective analysis workshop where the young women, you know, maybe they say they're 18, but maybe they're 15 or 16 or 18, or maybe they're 22. They all came together and they analyzed the stories, right? So the assumption is that people who are illiterate, who work, you know, 16 hours a day in a cotton mill, who've never been to school, can't do an analysis of their situation, and they can. They just need the right support to do it. And when they've analyzed their situation, they understand what is driving it. So out of that analysis, they created multiple action research groups, and one of them was focused on the relationship between health and loans, and the relationship between some of these sorts of crises that people face and the high interest loans that they had to create. And the group started off with meeting the women together in the village, and they said, well, we actually don't even know what we spend our money on. So they decided to do a survey of their own village and assess what they spent their money on. You know, perhaps they had a vague idea of what they spent their money on, but not their neighbor, and certainly not the whole village. Anyway, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like 20% of their money was spent on basic household necessities, food, clothes, shelter, those sorts of things, right? About 10% of it was spent on alcohol. About 20% was money that went to the temple, right? About another 20% was money that went on marriages, gifts, ceremonies, and all sorts of other things. And about another 20% went to the loan shark to pay off the debts from before. I'm sure that adds up to more than 100%. But the point I'm making is that they figured it out, and then they decided what they were going to do about it. So they took all of the villagers together with all of the community leaders, and they walked down to the temple and said, we can't do this anymore. We're not going to pay you that amount anymore. And they negotiated to reduce the amount they paid to the temple to 25% of what it was before. And they said, we're going to close the liquor stores. And they just went out and then they shut them down. Yeah. And they said, well, we can't afford these marriages anymore like this. We're not going to do that. And they started to think about collective marriages. And so bit by bit by bit, they decided to push the moneylenders out of the village. Right? But they took their own power to change their own destiny. Now, when that was reported to the other action research groups, they thought, oh, we want a bit of that. And they started to try all these things out. And then they began to get very similar results. And then you can start to see how it ripples out, and you could start to create transformative change. Now, I'm not saying all the change is going to look like that. And obviously, this is a particular change in the context of a particular set of communities that are working in the mills. But if they reduce their expenditure and they're not reliant on the loan sharks, then they're less dependent on going to the mills. And therefore, they have more power in relationship to conditions and all sorts of other things in relationship to the mills. So I suppose what I'm saying is that, you know, change has to happen at all levels. We talked about change at a government level, you know, thinking about how the taxation system works and how you build social protection. But also change emerges from people's own action on the ground. And there's such lovely examples of that, and we should never underestimate the power of the people to create their own change.
Great. Well, I'm really glad I asked you that, because that's really insightful. So we are reaching 9 o'clock. So I'm actually going to take some questions from the audience now. Thank you, all those that are listening, for giving us these questions. I'm just going to have a look. So Sharifa has asked, what if we do not have an industry anymore? What if everything is produced locally? We stop shopping for new items. Maybe Faith, do you want to take that one? What if we don't have an industry anymore?
I do want to take that one, just to play a bit of devil's advocate, I guess. I can't speak from, I guess I'd like to speak from what I think, just as a consumer, a citizen. I think that sounds really boring, basically. So like, if we don't have an industry, there are lots of problems for the people who work in it, which other people on this panel can definitely speak about better. But I think that sounds like a place with a bit less joy, to be honest. I mean, we like to inform our identities with the clothes that we wear. Possibly, you know, there are enough clothes in the world that we could share, and there are circular economies in that way, with, well, not circular, but sharing economies that could be built up. But yeah, I guess I just want to represent the voice of many consumers in the country, and myself, in saying that I love like new stuff sometimes, not necessarily brand new, but new for me. And that's another reason why I love boycott fashion, like commitment for the year, and shopping secondhand. So there's no way we're not going to have an industry anymore, right, guys?
Great. Well, thank you for your honesty there. Rahman, I think you want to chip in there, don't you?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I was like, I love new things too. And I think it's within all of us to like new things. That's why we walk into Asda and walk out with like 7 things that we didn't even want, usually food. But when it comes to fashion, I think we just need to re-understand what we actually mean about fashion, what we like about it. And I don't think it's about there not being an industry anymore. I think it's just actually just reshifting everything so that it actually looks after us and it looks after the world a little bit more, because we are always going to be shopping. People were shopping back from when there was like Neanderthals. They were still going to a market and exchanging gold for food. Like, we will always be shopping. I think to just stop everything is actually not sitting down, actually understanding what the problems are, actually understanding what the issues are and how it affects people. Stopping is denial. I think what actually needs to happen, and I think, Sharifa, you could probably lead this within your own communities, actually have those conversations with your friends, like how are they shopping, what are they buying, do they know where it's made? And if they get stuck for questions, goes to Extinction Rebellion and you'll find a lot of them, which you'll need.
Thank you. Danny, Claire, do either of you want to chip in on this one?
Yeah, I guess I could. I mean, I think there was a piece that I was reading by an academic quite some time ago that described shopping as civil war, and this sounds like a kind of a question of like how exactly do you engage in the peace talks, or what does the surrender look like, you know? And I guess going back to some of the things that Danny was saying earlier about this being a political issue and an economic one, and seeing all of the parts as entirely connected, I guess for me the change has to come through like something that's cultural, and by that nature will be inclusive of lots and lots of people, and in that sense sort of bringing people with. And so if we're looking at the kind of assessment of our economic arrangement that we live with now, particularly thinking about how people in the fashion industry, people in corporations and transnational corporations have an obligation to create growth, to pay back shareholders who don't who have a legal basis to demand that from them, then you have this sort of very, very multifaceted problem that seems very complex, and it seems like it's very, very entrenched. And I guess the most hopeful thing that I've looked at recently in terms of thinking about how we're moving into a collective sort of consciousness or like headspace of being ready to see something dramatically shift in this space, is that I think the people who are making the most radical economic assessments of like what needs to change, and I would count Mark Carney as one of those people, is that it seems more and more clear that if we're headed for on a path that leads to total self-destruction in terms of humanity, which is what we're on, there's no question, it's not a weird opinion to sort of voice anymore, then you can see a sort of pragmatic necessity for compassion. You can see a pragmatism around like embedding like the value of care at the center of a culture more firmly. And where if I feel like that's for me, yeah, that's the kind of interesting shift that I've been sort of looking at in the last week or two in all of that tirade of opinions that's been flowing my way, is kind of thinking about what is happening in the shift in people's sort of sense of really not just saying we need to shift our values, but like knowing that we need to shift our values, knowing it deep down and being really honest about it.
Yeah.
Danny, I feel
I've got a few thoughts.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you.
No,
The
yeah.
lovely people on Instagram would like to see your lovely face, and it's not.
No, I'm still moving into the wrong space. Okay, cool.
A little bit. Yeah, there we
No.
go. Perfect.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
way. Okay. Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I wanted to reflect on is that, you know, clearly people are going to have to wear clothes, as I said before. It's really about how we do it, and it's about what our model is. So if we say, for example, actually, we want to think about, you know, what are the clothes that that are less exploitative of the environment, and what are the clothes that are longer lasting? Can we create a culture in which people, you know, wear clothes for 6 or 10 years and they swap them, or they give them to charity shops and buy new ones, and so on? I think the key thing in terms of transformative change is that there is something that you hold a vision of. I mean, what we know about change is that you can't just say we don't like this. You have to say we're going to do this, and it's going to look like this. And sometimes that grows from really small seeds. I mean, you know, I'm thinking from personal experience. I became a vegan about 32 years ago. And when that happened, there wasn't a lot of vegans around. And we sounded like we were talking into the wind. But we did have a vision of the world that we believed in, which was less exploitative of natural resources, which did respect animal rights and various other things. But the point is that by putting a vision out there, people could move towards it. And I think when we're thinking about what does a clothing industry or a fashion industry look like, I think we have to paint a picture of what we want. And it may take a long time to get there, or it may be that COVID and other things accelerate that process. But unless we've got a very clear vision of what that looks like, then it's not going to happen. And that actually will end up with what we had before. So there will be a fashion industry, and it will be just as exploitative as it was, because we haven't articulated an alternative. But to have an industry which looks different requires us to do that work and to model it, and maybe to model it in a context where not a lot of other people are doing it, until it reaches a critical mass where that change can take place.
Thank you. I mean, one of the questions that I wanted to ask that maybe we can get to at the end was, you know, what's the dreamscape for the fashion industry? What is the ideal? You know, we're in this situation where, because it's a crisis, what was thought of as impossible could now be possible, but we have to have a vision. I don't know if anyone's itching to answer that question now. Rahman, do you have your hand up there?
Faith actually had her hand up first, and I saw her.
Yeah,
I'm going to give it to her first.
Okay, go on, Faith.
To Danny's point about you know, tangible vision making, I just wanted to share that I've been kind of collecting like visions of the future from different people I see commenting online, and some of those things specific to fashion, and I just wanted to offer this up to the group. Things like only having 2 collections a year, you know, things like eradicating drop culture from collections, no more celebrity or capsule collections, no more high street collaborations or discounting. Like, these are some of the things that are coming from, you know, the social media accounts of big mainstream influencers. So, like, to the group's point, some of these ideas just aren't, you know, even 3 months ago they could have been seen as totally radical, but something has happened in the last couple of weeks, months, in people's cultural shift that is making these ideas not seem so very far away anymore. So yeah, over to you. Those are just some of the things I'm hearing.
I mean, I just wanted to add to that and just say, like, what I see for the future is there's so many young designers who are doing amazing stuff with new business models, like Patrick McDowell, Bethany Williams, Richard Malone, like, who works in Tamil Nadu with like all sustainable weavers. If a young emerging designer can do something and it can be sustainable and it can be ethical and people can be paid fairly, you can scale that up and a bigger company can easily do the same thing. And I think like if, I mean, not too big, because then that's where it goes into exploitation, but you can scale things up. And I think if you look around and actually look at all the sustainable practices that are happening around the world, I think there's a lot to be learned. And I think all of those voices need to be at the table when we're deciding what that new model of fashion looks like. And I think I think the voice will be with the emerging designers, because as well, especially in London, is what we're known for, is that they have to be at the table when these decisions are being made. And I think that's the problem, is that a lot of the younger voices, pretty much a majority of us, are not in those decision-making rooms where they are like high up and governmental and push with legislation. Like, if we're just not there. And I think if we are, then our voice will be at that table, and we'll be able to talk for all the people that we work with, that we work for, and work, to. That was all I want to say. Sarah, you're on mute, just so you...
Again, sorry. Within Extinction Rebellion, something we talk a lot about is regenerative culture. And somebody called Darren is asking the question, can more effort be put on creating a regenerative culture within this current economic structure? Can people put money and time where their mouth is? That's what he said. So yeah, maybe Claire, do you want to give that one a go? Can we have a regenerative culture in this current economic structure?
Well, I doubt it, unfortunately, is the honest answer. I mean, I think it's structurally not possible, right? Which is why I sort of gave up trying to make fashion better and went and tried to change the whole system. It's like, oh, the fashion industry is not moving very quick. That's not happening. I'll just try something much harder. But I think the point is that, like, you know, particularly under the neoliberal model, it's not just the thing about capitalism, but it really is a thing about neoliberalism. The aim of neoliberalism is really to, like, precarize everyone, to funnel as much into as few hands as possible, and to really make everyone else very, very weak, which is what we've seen, like, for me as a younger person, like, unimaginable that all university lecturers eventually become, like, you know, really, really precaritized workforce that have no security, that it's most people are working on, like, really shitty contracts, really short term, or sort of borderline no contracts, or that nurses would be working through agencies on 0 hours. You know, people with a proper career, with a proper skill, and with real great benefit to society, that their work is understood to be, and it's obvious through this crisis, that there are people whose work is absolutely imperative to the functioning of a good society. And they are the people who have been treated the absolute worst by this system. And so when we can't even say that we're sort of remotely satisfied with the direction of travel here at home, then when we look at the way that, like, rich countries, you know, operate in countries with poorer workforces and with people who are at much higher social risk and with much lower social security and with much lower wages, you see this kind of unbelievable interaction, I guess. And particularly in the rich countries, you know, the spiraling levels of inequality are absolutely off the scale, aren't they? And so no, I don't think that regenerative things can happen while so much is being funneled out of the system by the super rich, by the most wealthy people. And the City of London, for example, is often cited by this government as a place where value is generated for the benefit of this country. And it's not. It's a place where value is sucked out. It is funneled out, and it is put in, like, tax avoidance. It's put on British territories where people can avoid tax. And it takes it directly away from the schools, away from the universities, away from the hospitals, away from all of the services that we need. So if you want to regenerate if you want a regenerative system, I think you definitely have to totally change the system, because I often hear people also sort of talk about the sort of fond memories of what capitalism was like when the factory owner gave you a house, you know, and you all lived in a community and everybody knew their place, but, you know, weren't they happy and well cared for by the kind old capitalist that was in charge of the big factory? And it's staggering, really, to think that that those levels of inequality and control of a workforce and oppression in society now look actually quite rosy to us, by comparison to a sort of invisible conglomerate that you have no clue who they are. There's no one you can ever phone up, but you're working for them through an app, and anything can go wrong at any point, and you've got nobody to speak to because you don't know who you're working for, really, and you've got no understanding of how you go back to them with any problems. And also you're being increasingly tracked and traced, and you know, we know that this is endemic in the warehousing sector as well, which I think is often an overlooked part of the fashion chain, which people often talk about garment workers, or you have campaigns around farmers, but the people who are working in the warehousing, picking basically things off shelves, who've got jobs at the moment for companies like Amazon, you know, they're practically having their heart rate monitored. They know when they go for a wee, people don't go to the toilet because they can't get across the warehouse in the amount of time that they've got allowed for a break. And if they take more time off than they're allowed, then they'll have that docked from their pay, or they might be at worst on like a 3 strikes and you're out scheme. So, you know, if you do go for a loo break and it takes you too long and you do that 3 times, you could lose your job, which is already precarious and already appalling pay. So no, I don't think that within this system as it is, I think it's kind of gone too far for that. And I think we're really looking at like trying to see a very much bigger system change, which is required in order to make something regenerative. And I think what's really interesting is that the seeds are there. So look, if you look at the news from Amsterdam just the other day, that they're going to be going for a recovery from the COVID crisis, which involves looking at Kate Raworth's work on donut economics. You know, they are looking at how you remodel a city's economy based on something which is firmly rooted in thinking about how do you live within the means of your resources that you have access to, and how do you do that in line with health, with education, with people's well-being. So people are starting to take these ideas much more seriously, and I think that's where the system change hopefully begins. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
Thank you for that brilliant explanation.
I could just add a few thoughts there. I mean, basically, I agree with Claire 100%. And I just thought it might just be worth reflecting a little bit. We've talked about Bangladesh and India and some of the countries where, you know, some of the poorest are going to get hit very hard. But look at the US right now. I mean, it's not just the countries where people are working in these awful conditions in small garment units. What's happened with Corona demonstrates explicitly the ruthlessness of this neoliberal system, the ruthlessness of this form of capitalism, you know, in this contemporary era. There isn't a chance that we could create a regenerative culture within this. So then when we're talking about how do we change the fashion industry or the clothing industry in order to be able to get the sort of changes we want, we're actually really ultimately talking about how do we shift it to be able to make the bigger changes in society we want to make. Because if we only make it in one small sector, then the forces which are driving capitalism as we know it today will just pull it back into the same place as it was before. So all of these actions that we take have to be directed at a much bigger sort of transformative change. That's partly cultural, but it's also very structural, as Claire has said.
Faith, I see your head nodding. I see Rahemur, I see your face. I think you're nodding a little bit. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
For me, oh no, sorry, Faith, ladies always first.
That's very polite. Mine's a quick note, which is just that I hope that more people outside of this community don't underestimate using the term system change. And I really hope that we don't see that term become a buzzword that people who don't mean it use. And I think that I've seen so much of that the last few days even, and I just hope that doesn't happen. So yeah, I guess we need to get moving on it before it can become a buzzword.
Rahemur, do you want to have a final say on that?
The bit that I was going to touch on was something that Danny said. I was like, like it isn't like everything's like roses over here in the West and the East is like crumbling. I did just want to share 2 bits of good news that Pakistan and Sri Lanka are paying directly to their workers. It isn't just about paying off the factory and making sure that they're still in profit and can actually move on. They're actually got bodies involved that actually make sure the money goes directly to the workers. And I think their model is a very good one for South Asia, which is like the 2nd biggest manufacturing unit after China, is actually to learn those lessons. And actually we could even learn those lessons here, and God knows America can. And yeah, that's all I want to say, really.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just choosing, we've got 10 minutes left, so I'm like, which questions am I going to choose? Can fashion ever truly be completely sustainable?
No. Fashion is not sustainable because like the whole industry is like, firstly, Danny's point about we need clothes to survive is valid, but needing clothes that's covered in crystals we don't. That's the luxury. That's the bit that's not sustainable. That's the bit that's not needed. But we want it. Like Faith was saying, like we walk into a shop and we'll buy stuff, like we do want these things, but it's just making sure that if we are going to have something that's glamorous and it's going to be massive and it's going to be buoyant, like just make sure it's good for the world and it's good for the people who made it, because that's your responsibility.
Anyone else want to give that one a go? Can fashion be sustainable?
I saw a really great meme recently. I can't remember where, but it was it was a round hole with a square peg, and one said fashion and one said sustainability, and it was just to demonstrate that they are often incompatible. So maybe it's just about changing the words we use, because it can be a force for good.
Yeah, and I would come back to the point I made earlier, which is that we need to distinguish between the fashion industry and fashion. I think fashion for sure can be sustainable. The fashion industry or the clothing industry, it has to become sustainable. Otherwise, we haven't got a planet to live on anyway. I mean, and it doesn't just apply to the fashion industry, it applies to every major industrial sector. You could equally ask the question of, can transport become sustainable? Can we all have washing machines and washing up machines and whatever it is? Can we all have cars, whatever? If you look at it at face value, you probably say none of it can be sustainable. But actually, and if you look at it through an equity lens and you say, well, actually, if everyone has the human right to have the same as everybody else, then it definitely can't be sustainable. So that does mean that we have to completely transform society. And that will mean to me that what we call fashion now has to look something different. And it is about, yes, we're wearing clothes, and yes, we will individualize those clothes, and we will turn them into expressions of all sorts of things, but they're not going to be able to be, processed in the way they are, transported across the world in the way they are, manufactured in the way that they are. It's all going to have to change.
Yeah, absolutely. Claire, I feel like you want to add something there.
Yeah, well, just that the purpose of quite a lot of the fashion industry, and particularly the fashion industry that we're used to, is predicated on exclusion and on status and on showing off, for want of a better word. And I think it's quite easy to forget that there has been like an intentional drive towards obsolescence. This was discussed at length in the 1950s and 60s. We need to make things obsolescent by changing trends more quickly, because otherwise we don't sell enough clothes. And I used to work with somebody at a company that made leather jackets, and she said, that she was old enough to remember when they started making worse linings in leather jackets, because leather jackets last too long. So it's too long until someone buys the next one. So what you have to do is make sure that the lining falls apart, because nobody really goes to the shop and gets it replaced. Nobody pays anybody to do that work. They just buy a new jacket. So you have to make something, if the outer is too hard wearing, which it usually is with leather, then you have to make it so you end up with a hole in the pocket. Otherwise, you can't guarantee that the person isn't going to come back and buy another one. And I think it sounds kind of conspiratorial to some people when you describe this as being done completely on purpose, but it's on record, you know, as people held meetings to talk about how to invigorate the economy in order to make it grow, in order to make people have a more vibrant economy, sure, but also in order to make certain people much more rich than they would get if they had a slightly slower state economy. And so we know that that's impacted on, like as Danny said, washing machines that you can't repair, right through to very, very cheap garments. And so this, you know, the industry that we inhabit now is part of a political project. And the reason why it looks and feels the way it does is because people made some choices, and we need people to make very different choices based on different sets of values. And, you know, that's the impossible dream that everyone has to let themselves believe is a possibility, I guess.
Does anyone want to add anything to that? We're done with that one. Okay, we've got some really great questions coming in. We've talked about the possibility of clothing being sustainable, but what about shoes? I mean, Danny, you're working with these people making leather. Like, most shoes are made of leather or they're made of plastic. So can shoes be sustainable?
That's a very good question. And actually, I mean, sometimes they get caught between different worlds where you're looking at the rights of laborers working in the leather industry, and you're looking at the ecological disaster of you know, animal slaughter, and my own personal long-standing position as a vegan and so on. And I struggle with all of this, actually, because I buy my shoes from wherever it is, some vegetarian shoe company, and I'm sat there thinking, well, actually that's made out of some petrochemical. And you're left with a very, very difficult set of choices, and I'm actually genuinely not sure what the answer is in relationship to shoes. Yeah, it's one that I've struggled with for about 30 years.
Faith, anyone? Any sustainable shoe options?
I can't speak on details really in terms of production of sustainable shoes, but it is one area that we see a lot of innovation happening, because in order to create a circular product that truly can be broken down and then rebuilt using those same material elements, that's much more difficult with a fabric garment. But with some types of plastics, and don't quote me on that one because I like I said, I don't know the details, but I think the point is that we haven't spoken much about innovation or circularity, and shoes is a space where that's being developed, you know, at quite a nice pace.
Brilliant. I mean, there is a new, I can't remember maybe Claire, do you know Tansi's book on shoes? Does anyone remember what it's called?
Yeah, it's called Footwork.
It's called Footwork, yes. So who was it that asked that question? Please check out that book. Okay, more questions.
And if anyone's got any solutions, can they let me know?
So we have a question from Carrie. She says, could some sort of guidebook be published that highlights companies who are doing the right things in terms of human rights, resource conservation, etc.? She points out that, you know, there's B Corps, they've met certain standards. So, you know, could fashion or even all consumables, could they have some kind of standards? Could we have a guidebook? Faith, maybe you want to take that one. I don't know.
There are lots of different charities, organizations, non-profits working on this kind of guidance, I guess, because if you are a consumer interested in buying more ethical clothes, I mean, you know, where do you start if you don't know anything about mechanism of the industry. So, I mean, there's lots of different ways to go, but I think just for the sake of time, it's Fashion Revolution Week, and they published their transparency guide today, I think. Transparency isn't the definition of sustainability for everyone, but if you can measure it, then you can start to change it, and that's what transparency in fashion is about. So I'd recommend going that way and having a little look at that list. And that is a list of 250 companies that, that are working on making their value chain transparent.
Great. I just wanted to point out that we've actually reached 9:30, but we've still got questions coming in. Panelists, do you mind if we actually take a few more questions? Yeah, okay, great. We got a thumbs up. So we're going to take a few more questions. Wonderful. Does anyone have anything to add to that? Any other recommendations of where people can find what good practice is, which brands they should be buying from? Okay, so it's obviously a gap.
I would just say one thing. I mean, I would agree with what Faith has said, is that there's lots of indexes now. And there's lots of organizations that can say, you know, these ones have got, you know, X, Y, and Z conditions for their workers. These ones allow trade unions. These ones do X, Y, and Z. I think all I would say is that there are definitely some companies that are better than others. And there are we definitely want to see progress in that direction. But I think we mustn't be, we mustn't delude ourselves that even the best of these companies often are completely missing out the hidden parts of the supply chains because they can't see them. You know, and you know, with the best will in the world, these mechanisms are only going to get us so far. So I think it's really important, and I think it is better to buy from companies that are trying harder, but don't let us delude ourselves that because they're on our list, that means that we've solved the problem.
Right. So we've also got...
add to that, sorry. I was going to say,
yeah, go on.
And I also think having a list of just all sustainable and ethical people defies the point. I think what really needs to happen is every consumer actually needs to go out and actually do a little bit of research. And I think that's what it's about. I think it's, if you gave someone a list of all the places that they can only shop and eat at, it doesn't help them understand why they're making that decision. And I think the only way we're actually going to change society is actually people understanding the decisions that they're making. And having a list of people to go to won't actually help anyone in the long run. It's just a plaster, and we're going to have to put it off, and we'll be back here doing the same thing.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. So I'm going to go on to our next question. So this is from Meg. And she says, do you think bringing manufacturing closer to home will create less exploitation in fashion? While it would be better for carbon emissions, what impact would it have on garment workers such as those in Bangladesh? I mean, Rahemur, do you want to maybe pick up on that one?
Only because there's two questions. I'll start with the first one. I think fashion and sadly exploitation go pretty much hand in hand a lot of the times. And I think that's why we're having this conversation, is actually try to reshift that and actually it not be so exploitative. And I think even if we was to actually start the manufacturing here, there would need to be kind of what the discussion we're having, a reboot, there would have to be a re-understanding of actually how a factory works and then implement that into the country here. But then if carbon emissions were down, the impact in Bangladesh would actually be huge. It's one of the biggest economies for Bangladesh. It's probably the only one that's actually making its GDP. Without the RMG sector, I don't think Bangladesh would actually be the country it is right now, investing in the country. What would need to happen is countries like that is actually diversify its income and actually look at other places like tech. And I think tech is probably a good place for Bangladesh, but now I just feel like I'm rambling. So
that's great. Though, I mean, maybe Danny, I'm sure you've got something to say about this. Should we bring manufacturing closer to home? But
well, I mean, I think there's, again, you get these tensions, don't you? Because we certainly should bring it closer to home from an environmental perspective. And that could potentially have implications for work and jobs in some of the countries where a lot of the production is created. I mean, just off the top of my head, one of the things I would be thinking is that if you do bring it home and you make things much more local, there are a lot less links in the chain for people to make a profit out of. So a lot of the reason why you get, child labor, for example, and exploitative labor is because the margins are so low, because there's so many people that need to take a cut at different stages in the process. So if you take out some of those stages and you take out the packaging of certain types and the shipping of certain types and so on and so forth, you might start to create a supply chain that allows for a more just distribution of wages. But I think that's, I think it's complex.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I see, Claire, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think something that's really apparent to me from working in the fashion industry, and particularly in the high street sector for the time that I was, is that a lot of people don't know how clothes are made. They don't know how textiles are made. They definitely don't know how shoes are made. And because we live in this system which for a relatively short amount of time has just sort of like magicked goods onto our shores and into our shops with like no understanding for the average British person probably of what life is like for somebody who makes clothes for a living. And probably like one generation ago, most people would know someone in the textile sector in the UK. So that's a very rapid like transition away from this country. It creates a massive knowledge gap where people just have no idea what things are made of. And even in our own industry, I've worked with buyers who think that leather comes on a roll, right? Like real leather. And, this is unbelievable, and to me, and as a young designer who just recently graduated, being in a meeting where a buyer is making like some kind of like awful joke about like the conditions under which somebody's making some kind of like beaded accessory that's going to go along with one of our garments, right? Whilst at the same time like lamenting how hard it is as a woman to take maternity leave, because you'll lose track of the trends and then you'll find it very difficult to enter back into your job if you take like more than 6 months off and that's what you want. And I'm going, wow, like this, firstly, when did like racist feminism become a thing, like for this person? But then also like how is it possible that the materiality of the production of that thing is so far removed, even from that person who's going to commission the make of it by signing the order docket? Like, how is it possible that they do that compartmentalization where they're able to like think about those conditions and crack a joke about it? And where I can meet a buyer who thinks that leather comes off a roll. Like there's such a lack of like understanding of the kind of materiality of the object itself and the complexity of all of the processes that it's been through. They say that like most textiles before they get on your back have been through about 40 different processes.
There's at least 40 in the leather supply chain. Yeah.
And things move sometimes continents in between all those processes. So most of the things that you buy are, as your vegetables are the same, they're more well-traveled than you will ever be in your life. And you don't know what they're made of, and you don't know how they were made, and you don't know how that was possible. That's not even going anywhere near mobile phones. That's not going anywhere near technology. Like the humility that you can get through recognizing your own ignorance, I guess, is like something that I think we do quite well to try and engender in the clothes buying public. And basically that's a kind of an education piece. And I don't quite know how you do it, but I've thought one way would always be really interesting to sort of go into get buyers or shoppers and encourage them to make a garment. And then look at what it looks like and make them wear it. Because it won't look good. Most of the time, maybe perhaps like an embodied exercise is a good educational practice, but I don't know what you think, Danny, about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great idea. Just one other reflection, which is not exactly following the thread, but it's picking up this issue of locality, which is worth just pointing out, which is that there is something which is happening with some of these big corporates and the way they're looking at their supply chains, in the sense that one of the things that we're seeing is that you're starting to get, in countries like Bangladesh and Myanmar, regulation of brands that have an international market. And what that's doing is it's pushing all of the exploitation into the domestic markets. So that's quite interesting because, you know, a lot of these countries, you know, I can't remember what the Bangladesh population is, but it's like 100 million people or something. I mean, it has a huge domestic market for clothes. And it's almost entirely unregulated because it doesn't have the pressure of the international. So there can be some merits in that international supply chain as well as the other way around. So I think you just have to sort of think about how all these things work. And if you go more local, then you've got to think about what are the pressure points which push that local market to be regulated in the way that some of the other parts of the industry are now. Because at the moment, you know, there are like huge swathes of not just garment supply chains, but other supply chains in the domestic markets. They're just completely unregulated at all because, as you said earlier, governments are just interested in GDP. They don't really care often. So if they haven't got pressure on their markets externally, they're quite happy to let that exploitation continue. So it's just things to think about really in terms of local versus global. There aren't any obvious and clear answers, but it is very clear that a lot of the worst exploitation is in the domestic markets.
Right. So we've got 3 minutes left, so we're going to have to wrap up. And to do so, I would just really love if we can all say, you know, who we are, what we do, and, you know, for those that didn't catch the beginning of this, and we've got like 2 minutes. So Faith, do you want to go first? I'm sorry you didn't get to answer that question.
No problem. Yep, so I'm Faith. I'm a freelance fashion consultant, and I guess to wrap up, I would ask everyone in this space to articulate what you want from fashion, and also to make sure you regularly step outside of your own echo chamber.
Brilliant. And Claire, you know, one last statement and who you are.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, thanks for having me. My name's Clare Farrell. I'm a member of Extinction Rebellion and the Fashion Action Group. I never know what to close on. I guess what I want to reinforce is the point that I made earlier, which is that I think when you're headed for self-destruction, it's quite clear that empathy and compassion become a pragmatic necessity for your life.
Danny, hand over to you.
Hi, yeah, I'm Danny, again, from the Institute of Development Studies, and my sort of connection here very much is around, well, apart from transformative change, is around directing a large program which is working against the worst forms of child labour called CLARISSA. My parting thought would be, it's really important when we're thinking about change processes to start with the people that are most exploited and most affected. And also in the sense of the environment, to start with the places where the unsustainable practices are most affecting the environment and people. So if you start with a child, you know, what choices does that child have to make? What's the journey? What's the decision-making process they're going through? It's only when you understand that you can understand how to transform the practices, because you can do whatever you like in a big company, but if that child hasn't got any food, they're going to find some work somewhere and they're likely to be exploited. And if you look at that from the point of view of the environment,
Danny,
you start with the exploitation.
I think we've got a couple of seconds left.
Carry on.
It's Rahemur, Rahman. Do you want to just say one last sentence and then we're done? I think.
Very short and snappy. I'm Rahemur Rahman. I'm a fashion designer. The only thing I'm going to ask everyone to do is during your isolation is research a group of people who don't look like you, who live nothing like you, and learn something about them, and that will help change the world.
Brilliant. So if we've got some time left, we do have a People's Assembly happening on Saturday. I think details for that are in the Facebook chat. And thank you so much to the panelists. I think this has been an amazing discussion, and thank you all to those who have been listening in on all the different channels. Brilliant.